So hello and welcome to the New Gig podcast. I'm your host, Glen Hodgson, and today I'm delighted to be joined by thought leader, lecturer, and also author, Matthew Mottola. How are you doing, Matt?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Glenn.
It's a pleasure to have you here. And, for the people who don't know, for the viewers and listeners here, can you give a little bit of the backstory? How did you get into this crazy thing we're calling the platform economy?
Totally by accident. Every good thing happens by mistake, right? So, no, my background was I played college sports. That's what paid for college for me. And I couldn't do a full-time internship, but I knew I could do something part-time. So I just went business to business, asking how can I help, did a lot of like management consulting, business planning, business research, sort of freelance projects, not knowing it was called the freelance economy, right? Like I can go in and say, hey, I'm a freelancer that can do freelance projects. But it really opened my eyes up to what I would call this accelerated opportunity feedback loop, where what I was doing in a couple months or a couple weeks would prior have taken me a couple years. Because instead of having a 3-month internship every year, I was having a 2-week project, consecutively. And so that's sort of what opened my eyes to it, totally by accident, purely because I needed to make money when I was in college.
Excellent. So I think this is, maybe we can change the saying to accident is the mother of all invention. But I think that it's a great story that you get into there and can relate to how people do these. But, in terms of the way we're looking at the situation today, what are kind of the opportunities, but also what are the challenges that we're seeing faced within the platform economy?
Yeah, I think so. We'll start with the rosy, right? In terms of what is the good. So all the platform economy does, we can call it freelance economy, human cloud, whatever. All it does is it takes out a lot of the middle layers of getting work done and replaces it with software. And software is sort of free, right? It doesn't cost anything to transact something. It's also global. And so the huge opportunity is the fact that instead of needing all this middle layer just for you and I to work together, we have all these tools that can take care of it. And so the fact that I can be sitting in Miami, you can be sitting in Sweden, like we can't underestimate how important that is. And then if you extrapolate that into what we're talking about with work, okay, now we know that a lot of the work we can do thanks to COVID, we know that it can happen remote. And so let's extrapolate, how can we take the fact that you and I can talk together to actually building stuff? And so we go from being able to have this Zoom meeting to being able to create a marketing campaign, a website, a bunch of different digital opportunities. So that's the good, is that the ability to create and collaborate together has never been better.
Absolutely.
The bad is that there's no infrastructure here in terms of there's no process, there's no regulation. It's kind of the wild, wild west. And so like with any technology trend, those that were first usually make a boatload of money. And then those that aren't necessarily on the right side of it can be exploited. But so we're in this situation right now where we kind of have extremes. We have people that were on the fringes that were early who are doing very, very well. And we're trying to do this in an ethical way. And so there are some very unethical models. I think if you look at the traditional freelance and gig economy, I do believe that the gig economy is broken, and I believe that it's exploitative at its core. But with that said, that doesn't mean that the future should be that way. So the good is there's never been more opportunity. The bad is we do have to put some guardrails up and sort of make a decision on how we want this economy to look.
Yeah. And that brings us into a very interesting point there, Matt, that like most things to be sustainable, there need to be some rules of the road. People need to feel comfortable and have a role within it, both from the sort of the employer-employee side, from a government perspective as well. If not, this kind of withers on the branch. So this is the kind of things that is it's self-interest for the whole sector to have these rules, regulation, and practices.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, one of the quick, let's just look at like what tangibly can go wrong, right?
Yeah.
If those are out there listening, they've heard the term Amazon Mechanical Turk.
Yes.
That scares the crap out of me. The fact that humans are pushing buttons in the dark, and that's not good. But if we look at some of the stories in the book, we have people that are, mothers, that are military spouses, fathers, people that had family situations that they had to be there for their family. And in a full-time environment, they wouldn't be able to do this. They would have to choose between just being a mother or just being a career woman or just career father. But now there's an opportunity galore. You can stay a career father or career woman while being a good parent. One of the situations in the book that I love is like this woman had her brother died unexpectedly. And instead of bosses saying, hey, come to this meeting, come to this meeting, come to this meeting, she ended up saying, screw it, I'm going to be a freelance bookkeeper. And she's making 6 figures. And so, yes, there is massive opportunity to make work for us versus this, the past 150 years where it's very office-based and 9 to 5.
Yeah. And I like the way this comes out in the book as well. There's 2 things that really strike me initially. One is the kind of the idea of a company being a physical space, a 9 to 5 place that you go to. And the second is the whole idea of some of the negativity that's been around the fact that freelancing, gig economy is a way to kind of slack off and work half as hard as real workers or traditional workers, if you want to call it that. Whereas what comes through sort of loud and clear is the fact that this is not an option to do things easier. It's not an easy track. If you're gonna still work as hard, if not harder, but the opportunity's there. There's a great democratization effect involved here as well, Matt.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that's why we use the term change makers, because if you look at the person that this type of economy does disproportionately benefit, it is those that take massive pride in their work. And it's not the crowd that says, hey, I want a 4-hour work week. It's the crowd that says, I want my work to be meaningful and I want to make a positive impact in the world. Yeah. And so I do usually, I rub people off a little bit the wrong way at times because I'll say, work-life balance, screw that. I don't want that. And in this new economy, I'm not too sure if that's also a part of it. But we do know that if you want to make an impact, you want upward mobility, this is an incredible model for that.
Yeah. And one of the things that comes through loud and clear in the book as well, Matt, is this idea of impact and value. The fact that the people who can deliver the impact, deliver the value, regardless of location, job titles, they're the ones that are going to prosper in this sort of the current environment and even more so into the future.
Exactly. So I'll use like my own selfish example, right? And hopefully this is the last time we hear my story and we hear more of the others. But so in terms of this aspect of opportunity, so at first, my first entry into it was the fact that I could work with CEOs, executives, people that were really high decision makers. And so my learnings were way accelerated because instead of going and working at a company for 5 years just to earn my stripes to be able to be a manager, I was working with the people, the decision makers right then and there. Yeah. The second thing, though, was that I learned that I could hire fellow freelancers instead of having to have headcount and budget. And so one of the massive things when you're in a large company is if you want to make an impact, you kind of have to become higher up in management. And it can take 15 plus years, where in the freelance economy for me, I was managing after I think like 6 months. I was then hiring fellow freelancers to build up the projects.
Yeah.
So I was hiring on all different continents. And so that's why I call it the accelerated opportunity feedback loop, because it's not necessarily creating anything new, but it's accelerating your ability to make an impact.
Yeah. And within this, Matt, what do companies as well as individuals really need to think about? What do they have to have in mind to be able to take on board the new skills, but also adapt to this new reality so that they can prosper?
Yeah, good question. So let's start with the why. And I know I'm not directly answering the question. So the why for the company is speed and cost efficiency. And the reason I say speed is not to do something in a day, but to be able to validate experimentation or innovate or whatever it is in a faster manner. And the real tangible reason for that is you can get a freelancer in the building in minutes, whereas if you want to get an agency or a full-time employee, that can be different. Second thing is cost efficiency. If you're going to bring a full-time employee, labor laws are different all around the world, but there is this general sentiment of you don't need an employee at all times. And so you might need an employee for this one thing, but then you're stuck in a utility distribution. Whereas when you hire a freelancer, they might be more expensive per hour or per day or whatever the unit is, but you're getting them for that specific project. So from a company side, why do you actually care about this? Well, you can be faster and you can be more cost efficient. And when we think about what COVID has done, I mean, companies need new business models overnight. And so that's sort of the spiel from a company side. From an individual side, it's kind of similar, but the big difference that I would say is there's more control. And so, here's the thing, full-time work is actually starting to reflect what it's like to be a freelancer in various ways. But so I believe in 5 years that full-time employees will also be remote and they'll work in a flexible manner. But what is distinctly unique about freelancing is that you're able to own your merit. And so if you work for a company, how you've done is stuck in a feedback system. If you work as a freelancer, that's yours, right? That rating, that review, that portfolio, whatever it is, it can't necessarily get locked behind a feedback system so that when they want to keep you or golden handcuff you, they use it.
And how's you've talked about your work with sort of C-suite operators. How are HR and sort of recruitment staff with this? Some of the feedback that I've got that they're a little bit slower to adapt. There's some of the barriers in some cases because they see it as almost a threat to their existing roles. What's your kind of insights on that piece, Matt, as well?
Yeah, so it depends on where you're sitting in HR. If you are a recruiter or a sourcer, this can affect you. It doesn't have to, but this can, because instead of needing to go through a Robert Half or a staffing agency or even your own internal, you have a bench of freelancers that you can directly engage with. And then when you need them a second time, you don't have to source, right? So that's the first thing. Let's not underestimate that. With that said, finding freelancers is pretty tough. And so even though you can go to direct to talent, there will always be a place for something or someone in the middle to provide curation on who the right freelancer is. So with that said, there will always be a place for them. The second aspect that you touched on is HR, specifically, how does hiring freelancers impact our existing employees? And let me give you one really, really tangible hiccup that your employees might face if you're hiring freelancers at scale. There might be a freelance designer that at the surface level is making 1/10 of what the same designer is that's a full-time employee. Your employee is going to freak out. Like, there's no getting around that, right? An employee is not going to be like, oh, I love this company, they're not going to fire me on a layoff. Like, no, there's no hiding it. Like, and it depends on what company you're talking about, but let's be honest, at least from a US perspective, like, the corporate employee relationship is gone. No one trusts companies anymore. And this whole, like, we're a family and we're not going to lay you off is, for lack of better words, it's crap, right? So from an HR perspective, there is a bunch of risk in terms of if you're hiring freelancers at scale, there is some, you could call it geographical arbitrage or whatever. There is some risk there that your internal employees will freak out and say, oh no, am I next in line? Am I going to have to become a freelancer, which we can discuss later. It's no longer, you get fired to become a freelancer. But so that is one massive risk. A second risk, though, we just did a couple ones, but a second risk there that can sit between HR, compliance, and legal is classification. And this is probably the biggest risk that companies are going to face. Classification means you're hiring someone as an independent contractor, but you should have hired them as an employee. And what's the big sort of net impact is the government's going to say you should have paid taxes. So there's going to be a tax incentive, right? Yeah. And then from an employee side, you should have given them benefits and that kind of stuff. But so there is 100% a risk. The two major ones are your internal employees freaking out. But then the second one, which is usually the largest, is this classification risk. And in the US, we're undergoing actually a pretty seismic shift from a policy perspective and how we think about this, but we can get into that later.
Yeah. And would you say that the average individual, the average worker is ready for this reality? We look at sort of the growth rates, anywhere from 10 to 30% annually, depending on the geography where you're sitting. This is something that's not going away, Matt. This is something that's just getting bigger and bigger, and this exponential growth. People need to be ready for it. Do you think they are?
No. Sorry. I know, like, the thought leader's answer should be, well, of course, right? Yeah. Or no, but no, I mean, we call it the amplification effect. What I mean by that is that if you are valuable in a full-time setting, most likely you're going to be better off as a freelancer. You're going to make more money. You're going to have more control. If you're not valuable in a full-time setting, you're going to have a rough time because, like we said before, the controls are kind of thrown off. Yeah. Now, let's make this really tangible. The best place to be in terms of getting your feet wet or getting started as a freelancer is to have prior experience in a project-based workflow or an outcome-based workflow. So think about if you're a designer working for an agency, you probably already have clients to turn to. You understand sort of the working style versus if you're someone like an accountant that's been working in a service function that has no idea of like working on a contract basis. So that's one of the big differences is that we're shifting from sort of just here's a full-time contract to here's an outcome-based workflow. Yeah. In terms of who's better off, there are some differences, but a lot of them reflect full-time employment. So if you're a developer, freelancing is going to be awesome for you because you're high in demand. If you're a marketer, it might be harder to get your first initial contracts, but once you get them and you get sort of your flywheel going, life's going to be better.
Yeah.
But so that's sort of the initial impact, is that is the workforce ready? Some people are, some people aren't. Some people are going to have an easier time. Some people are going to have a more difficult time. The highest level sort of driver there is the fact that you're going to have to go from a contract to an outcome. There's ways to mitigate that. But I'd say in general, some of the workforce is, some of the workforce isn't. One other indicator is the younger generation. I think it's like, at least in the US, over 50% of Gen Z is already freelancing, and over 40% of millennials are already freelancing.
Right.
And it's actually very similar to going to school, where you have multiple classes, right? So a lot of times students, they'll be like, wait, so that project that I did, I could have got paid for? And then they'll be freelancing like as a sophomore, and then they'll be like, what the hell? Why am I going back to school? I'm not getting paid for any of this. And I'm like, I know, just go. just go. Don't question, just go. But yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting though, Matt. You know, we're not necessarily advocating dropping out here or anything like that. Definitely not. But it's interesting what you say also about the bringing it onto the education side. You know, loud and clear that sort of the workforce is not ready. Do we think our educators and the education systems are actually preparing individuals for the new reality, which is not really the future? It's already here now, and the people that can adapt quickest to this new reality are the ones that are going to benefit? Or is that another no?
Yeah, this one's a little more like some are, some aren't, and I think I've been framed by and for context, I guest lecture at Georgia Tech, and I help them sort of build out their entrepreneurship curriculum with a focus on this. And so I worked very deeply with one of their professors there to dive into this. And so, I've done that. And then I also went to grad school at a school called Babson College, which is very, very entrepreneurial. So the context is some schools are actually very well adapted to this already. And usually it's when they have some sort of entrepreneurial spin. And the reason for that is then usually there's access and opportunities for working on a project-based manner. Yeah. So what that looks like very, very tangible, is if you have students doing case studies, specifically doing projects for real companies, that's great. That's awesome. In fact, I did a consulting project that would have been a great freelance build, and it would have been a 5 to 25K freelance build. Didn't get paid for it, but it's good for the company and good for the students. But no, some universities are very well adapted, some aren't. There's some structural things, but it's really tough because we don't want to over-index. And what I mean by that is kind of like when STEM first, not when STEM first came out, but when STEM, as we know, is very, very important. You don't want to over-index and say every single person should now be engineers, because we're going to have no one to actually design the software if everyone is just, really, really deeply heavy technical. It's a similar thing with freelance. We don't want to over-index where we're saying, hey, every single student should now have to be freelancers, because the whole workforce isn't going to be freelancers. They're still going to be full-time employees. It's just going to look different, right? There's going to be different compositions of it. So that would be, my answer for education is some are doing great, some aren't. And the real factor, similar to employees, is, are you helping your students work on a project basis? And are you helping them identify their unique value and really, really start to quantify, monetize, and enable that so that they can have a freelance career? And it's also not just freelancing, because a lot of, upcoming generation, staying in a job for over a year isn't that normal anymore. Like, I stayed at a startup for 10 months, and then I did Microsoft for a year and 10 months. And I'm the old one that's like, no, you should stay at a job for 2 years. So it's,
That's a real difference. And I think there's this accelerated element that sort of comes into a lot of your sort of writings and your thoughts, I think is something that is really valuable for people to take on board. But maybe if we can just end this episode by giving us Matt's top tips. These people are maybe they're in a traditional role, or maybe sort of getting the feet wet with a bit of freelancing work. If individuals want to take that leap, moving into sort of the freelance platform economy sector, what are the sort of the tips and hints that you would like to be able to pass across?
Yeah, I'd say step one is identify your outcomes. And an outcome is going to be something that has a clear deliverable, a clear timeline, and a clear cost. And so look back at what you've done and start to pick out what are some of those outcomes that you could quantify and monetize. And so let's say you've been like a product marketing manager. What have you done in that role that the individual outcome you could quantify and sell? And so maybe you got really, really good at creating presentation decks. Maybe you got really good at creating infographics or really good at creating press releases or things of that matter. That's a tangible skill that going forward you can monetize in a freelance workflow. And maybe not even in a freelance workflow, you're going to go to your next company and you're going to say, I can do these exact outcomes. That turns into your job responsibilities. So that's step one. Step two is now go and meet the type of people that you think are going to drive your career forward. One of the big differences in a freelance economy versus just normal employment is that when you jump into normal employment, you have your colleagues, but it's not as clear how much your colleagues are going to help you going forward. Like we all know about terms like in the US, something called like the PayPal mafia, where, you know, the people you worked with at first end up creating all your opportunities. Yeah. What's different about freelancing though, is that your network is actually even more important than it was prior. And so I'll give you two dichotomies. If you're a leader, really, really dig into the freelancers that you want to build with for the next 50 years of your life, because the people you work with today, you're going to work with for the rest of your life. I always turn back to the first 15 freelancers I've always worked with. If you're just someone who's a little more passive, which isn't a bad thing, more of an individual contributor, then your jobs and your opportunities are going to come from your fellow freelancers as well. So first, quantify your outcomes. Second, understand the people that you really, really want to drive forward with going forward in your career. And then I will say third, which is a little more like you might not have time for this and that's okay, is dig into the process and specifically really learn how to create a statement of work. I think as I've looked back at sort of what's been important in my life, the ability to quantify really quickly what value can I deliver to you, how long will it take, and what will the cost be, and be able to structure that into a contract that I can then send an invoice for, that's actually been pretty essential. And I don't think absolutely everybody has to have that, but you probably should. You should have that understanding. So yeah, so understand your outcome, understand the people, and then have a little bit of process behind you.
Excellent. Well, Matt, these are nuggets of gold, and I really appreciate the fact that you've taken the time to come on this episode and share them with us. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Glen. That was a blast.